Hello, and welcome to the Ring of Brujas discussion on HooDoo, Conjure, and Rootwork. All basically the same thing. We'll get into some of the delineation a little bit further into the conversation. This is Katrina Rasbold, and I'm excited to be bringing you information and dialogue about this particularly fascinating and much disputed uh, practice, magical practice. I do a stream of consciousness discussion here because if I back up and re-record over every mistake, this will never get finalized. I'm a Virgo, and so I tend to OCD over the things that are wrong and have to just push through and then upload to YouTube for your enjoyment. So we are going to talk about the process of HooDoo. Now, we just recorded for the purposes of Griga Bruja a discussion on Appalachian granny magic. And although these two practices have their similarities, one thing that's very, very different about it is that with Appalachian and Ozark granny magic, we have a very distinct and mostly undisputed history. It's very clear where it came from, how it grew, what influences pervaded upon it. And when we go to hoodoo, we start to get through, of course, through some really almost unnavigatable waters that are pretty treacherous and rocky. In hoodoo, one thing you'll learn very quickly as you start to explore it and get into the histories that are recounted by different people, you'll find that there are multiple truths. And that's the kindest way that I can put it. People are very aggressive about their truths of the origins and the development of hoodoo. And what I'm trying to do with this particular presentation is to straddle the really, really wide abyss between those truths and try to find something down the middle from an academic standpoint of what actually happened in the development of this wonderful practice. So go with me on this and understand that my truth might not be your truth. It might not be the truth of some of the mentors that are out there who are wonderful practitioners, but I'm going to tell you how I know it to be. And I'm very open to intelligent discussion on other ideas. This one thing we do know about hoodoo is that it has basically three different origins that came together ultimately to create the hoodoo that we know right now in popular culture. Western and Central Africa were a major foundation for hoodoo. We then had the Haitian influence that came in from Haiti, and then we had New Orleans-based hoodoo, which sort of took components of all of it and blended it together, much like the jambalaya, and created their own deal. So what's going to happen in this presentation is we're first going to talk about African American hoodoo, which is an entity unto itself. And then we're going to backtrack and talk about the development of the New Orleans-based hoodoo, which is what most of the practitioners that you see in the common market now are doing. And you'll see some similarities, strong similarities. You'll see some real aggravated people out there too, and we're going to talk about some of the reasons for that. This is very much an amalgamated religion or magical practice. It's not so much a religion now as just a non-secular uh, magical practice, but it didn't always start out that way. And that's one of the positions we're going to look into as we move through this discussion. Because originally, as the slide here says, when hoodoo came from Africa, number one, it was not called hoodoo, it was their way of life. It was a blend of the sacred and the secular. They didn't have a separation. They didn't set it aside and say, this is our magical practice and this is our religious, spiritual, sacred practice. It was all one thing. And they didn't say this is voodoo and this is hoodoo, as many people do now. So we originally had this blended practice that was how they connected to their pantheon of gods and how they connected to the spiritual self. Now it does focus now and then on the use of herbs, roots, minerals, dirts, animal parts, and body effluvia to heal. So there's a huge emphasis in hoodoo on healing and on protection, and also there is some that is on revenge, and they see that as part of the protection side of it. Hoodoo went through several forced adaptability stages that we'll talk about that changed the practice fundamentally as it moved through these cultural shifts that were forced upon the practitioners. And we also have a very renewed popularity of hoodoo as of late. You've probably noticed in the last 2 or 3 years, all of a sudden, everybody is a hoodoo practitioner. Everybody is a root worker. Whereas before that, we had in the magical community, everybody was Druid or everybody was Wicca. We have these phases that come through. And right now, hoodoo's hot. Hoodoo's very busy right now. And a lot of the reason for that is because it's very adaptable to what you're doing in your life. It's very practical and it's very effective. It doesn't center so much around ceremony and expensive items to procure. So right now it kind of fits into the times that we're living in. So when the slave traders captured the indigenous African people and brought them over to the United States and then also to Haiti, as I said, they didn't have that separation. And one of the things they could bring with them was their spiritual practice and their healing practice. Often they couldn't even bring their own clothes on their backs. They had to just be divested of anything from their home. And so this was one thing that they could bring. And as I said before, they did not refer to this as voodoo and they did not refer to this as hoodoo. In fact, the etymology of that particular word is one of the most hotly debated topics in hoodoo and voodoo. Katrina Hazzard-Donald, who is one of the greatest researchers of true African hoodoo, said hoodoo was the glue that held the slave community together. It really did define the uniqueness of the culture in the face of aggressive and abusive pressure to mainstream into a society that didn't offer them anything. And so this was something that kept their individuality and kept them bonded together. An interesting point is that it is theorized, and most people are of the opinion that the term black magic was not to define light from dark in terms of magical presentation. It was not to define evil from good specifically, as we intellectualize it must have been, but was actually a racial experience and was to identify the, oh my gosh, so awful voodoo of the black people and the African American people as opposed to the nice, clean magic of the white people. And so when you think about black magic, most people, thanks to Hollywood, think of what Hollywood calls voodoo practices and the harming of other people. Part of that comes into play because in hoodoo, there is not as much resistance to harming as there would be in other cultures. When we think of Wicca, for instance, we have the whole premise of harm none. Hoodoo has no such compulsion in that regard. They usually do not seek to aggressively harm others, but they absolutely will defend themselves and retaliate if need be. And something to consider in regard to this is a lot of times we look at this and think, oh, I would never do that, or I could never harm another with my magic. And that may be so, but it's interesting to note that that comes from a position of tremendous privilege where you are not threatened to the point that you would magically harm someone. And believe me, there are situations that can come up where most people absolutely would do that. So when you think of black magic, realize that that is a racial connotation in most situations rather than just delineating between light and dark. When people have a loss of hope, when people have a, a real descent into poverty, especially people who are not accustomed to being in poverty, they tend to move toward more aggressive magic, and that backs up that idea of harming none being a position of privilege. Another thing that I really love is that Victor Anderson, who is the founder of the fairy FERI tradition of witchcraft, once said, "White magic is poetry, black magic is what works." And I believe that this very premise is what draws people to what they perceive as a more grassroots form of magical practice when the societal infrastructure is in turmoil to the point that huge groups of people are disenfranchised. We tend to see this movement into very, very practical magic rather than the prettier Renaissance fair type magic. Not that it doesn't serve its purpose and not that it's not there, but just in general population, people tend to go toward this when the spirit is in pain and needs to reach out for spiritual or magical assistance. The accountability and the hands-on power that is afforded by hoodoo practice tends to draw in more people just every day. We're going to go over a very quick glossary here so that people who are listening have an idea what we're talking about when we use some of these words that might be unfamiliar. ATR means an African traditional religion that originated in Africa and moved into the United States as the slaves were forcefully moved into the United States. The African diaspora it refers to communities that are created by the movements of African people to other areas by cultural changes that occurred and by enforcement. Conjure is a very loose term, much like paganism, and it simply refers to folk magic. So when we're talking about Appalachian magic, when we are talking about the traiteurs of the Cajun uh, variety in New Orleans, when we're talking about Native American practice, when we're talking about the Gullah Geechee of South Carolina, these are all forms of conjure. So conjure is just a very broad term. Hoodoo is the traditional African magical practice that was brought to the United States through slave trade, although they would not use the word magical. The Loa is a pantheon of deities that is specific to voodoo. The root worker is a person who practices hoodoo. Santeria is a Cuban Afro-Caribbean religious practice that also uses the Loa. Syncretism is a word you're going to hear pretty often. That's the amalgamation of one religion onto another religion, usually to make that religion more palpable to other people. Voodoo is a traditional African religion that has influences from other surrounding religions, and voodoo, Voodoo, is pretty much centralized to Louisiana. It was at first considered a slur or a derogatory term as a misspelling of Vodou, voodoo. And but what happened was Louisiana and New Orleans embraced the spelling of Voodoo and made it their own. So that kind of transitioned into being their thing. Now, at the beginning of each one of our discussions on these American folk magic practices, the first thing we do is talk about what the practice is not. Hoodoo is not pagan. It is primarily a Christian base. Now, for the people who were not in Louisiana and who were practicing hoodoo, the tendency is that it synchronized onto the Protestant Christian religion. Within Louisiana, because that was a French territory, it synchronized onto the Catholic religion. So when you're hearing about New Orleans voodoo or New Orleans hoodoo or Creole hoodoo, you're going to be talking about the working with the saints and the Catholicism aspect of it. But when you're talking about the Deep South, away from the Gulf, then we're talking about Protestant, Baptist, Methodist uh, religions that are being used in connection with hoodoo. Hoodoo is not witchcraft, and it is not Wiccan. So kind of get those ideas out of the way. This is its own practice. And also you have to lose the idea of what Hollywood has told you that voodoo or hoodoo is. There aren't people walking around with shrunken heads. They don't have zombies. They're not Satanists. They're not cannibals. That is an invention of Hollywood and was part of the smear campaign to demonize what the African Americans were doing for their religious and magical practice. When we look again at the idea of voodoo, we have to think about what an author named Zora Neale Hurston actually said, which she said, hoodoo or voodoo, as it is pronounced by the whites, indicating that voodoo was actually a term that was put onto the practice by Caucasians. The theories are very strong that, as I said, that voodoo was actually at one time a slurred or derogatory reference to hoodoo, a mispronunciation. Santeria, and we talked about this briefly, is very similar to hoodoo in key components, but it's not the same thing. So we're going to say that and keep that out of the idea that it's part of what we're talking about here. It had influence, but it was not, it's a whole other ballgame. In current practice, the common understanding is that voodoo is a religious practice of the Haitian origin. And it was modified in Louisiana with French and Creole components to create New Orleans voodoo. and it has a theology that a supreme being is working in concert with the team of deities called the Loa. Hoodoo, on the other hand, is a magical tradition and practice that is now secular. Although some voodoo practitioners may also work hoodoo, not all hoodoo workers do voodoo. So it can be in either or. Now let's talk about what hoodoo actually is. Hoodoo, as is now practiced, is an amalgam tradition that is based on African magical practices. It's influenced by the Appalachian magic that found its way into it as the hoodoo practitioners moved further north after the Civil War during the Reconstruction. It's influenced strongly by Native Americans, the Creole, the French within Louisiana, and even German powwow made its way into it. It's not a religious practice itself at this time, but it draws on Protestant, Christian, faith-based components, and it sometimes involves the use of the Psalms, the scriptures, as magical incantations. Excuse me. And in Louisiana and New Orleans, they use the saints, and their liturgical words are of the Catholic faith rather than of the Protestant. So, as I mentioned before, this is a very diverse sort of belief system that people are very polarized in, and you'll see why in just a second. Now, Katrina Hazzard-Donald, who I mentioned before, defines hoodoo in a really wonderful way. She says it's the indigenous herbal healing and supernatural controlling spiritual folk traditions of the African American in the United States. And that really is a strong definition. And again, it's from Africa and Haiti with varying degrees of influence from other cultures due to the African diaspora. It was orally transferred until recent times because a lot of its practitioners were illiterate, and so it was all done by song, it was all done by voice, it was all done by rhyming, it was all done by passing down generation to generation, person to person. It's divided into three evolutionary stages that we are going to explore individually, that were created by forced adaptation and cultural migration. We have to thank, for the information we have, some really strong researchers who got in there and dug up vital information on the development of hoodoo and how it originated. One of the most lauded researchers is Harry Middleton Hyatt, who was an Episcopal minister, excuse me, and between 1936 and 1940, he interviewed over 1,600 self-identified hoodoo workers and believers from all over the country, and he collected 13,458 spells and folklore beliefs that he published in these 5 volumes down here. It was a 4,766 page set titled Hoodoo, Conjuration, Witchcraft, and Rootwork. Now, to the date, and you can see how long that's been, almost 100 years, this is the most extensive and ambitious collection of hoodoo information that has ever been published. It was very strong and it was very highly criticized. It's considerable, it's huge, and it's impressive. But of all of these 1,600 self-identified hoodoo workers that he interviewed, only one of them was white, despite the fact that many of the interviewees said you should also interview these white people because they are doing this as well. The fact that he himself was Caucasian and was interviewing African American hoodoo workers caused there to be the belief that there was some language barrier going on, and that perhaps he didn't quite capture exactly what they were saying. He was also very indiscriminate in who he interviewed and had some real lunatics in his interviewing process. Some of the people were describing weird things like hoodoo initiations, which is, it's not an initiatory process. It didn't happen. And some spells and ceremonies that were very obviously fabricated that he printed nonetheless. So that's Hyatt. We move along to Zora Neale Hurston, who's the person I quoted before about saying, as white people say, voodoo. Zora Neale Hurston was a novelist, and she wrote these amazing novels in the 30s and 40s that very strongly portrayed the life of the hoodoo culture in historical times. And it was actually through various phases of the development of voodoo and hoodoo. Albert Raboteau wrote an instrumental book called Slave Religion, and actually was a seminal study of slavery that helped to launch the Black Studies movement of the 1970s. Yvonne Chireau wrote a book called Black Magic that was a very extensive and sometimes painfully frank study of Conjure from the slavery period all the way through to the 20th century. And we have Katrina Hazzard-Donald, who actually wrote a book called Mojo Workin that's arguably the consummate academic volume on the origins and development of hoodoo, both as it came over from Africa and throughout the African diaspora. So if you look at this slide, you can see the foremost respected and aggressive researchers who really got in there and learned about, studied the growth of hoodoo, the beginning of hoodoo in the United States, all the way up to the current time. Now, as I mentioned, this is a very divisive community. And I think that when I show you a picture of our well-known modern root workers into today's society, you'll understand why this is a very sensitive topic. These are some amazing people who are doing great things in Conjure and in root working and in hoodoo. But you can right away, and I just want to point out right from the beginning, some of these are my mentors. Some of these are the people that I've learned the most from regarding Conjure, root working, and hoodoo. But you can see right away why there is some divisiveness in the community, because we don't have a huge prevalent face of the African American within the root workers, at least not the root workers who are monetizing this process. And when you go deeply into the websites and the forums that are surrounding this practice, you see right away a whole lot of sniping and backbiting and defending themselves and talking about who's legit and who's not legit and who has the right to be here and who doesn't have the right to be here and what this person said about me and what I said about them. And it's all over the place. It's very hateful and very aggressive in its attacks. And as I was studying this, I asked one of my mentors, Maya Shelley Gray, who I adore, why this was so. Why were these people so vicious in their attacks of each? Actually, what I said was, why are these people such assholes? And she had a very well thought out response. And she said, everybody's trying to just carve out their niche. And one of the things she pointed out that really resonated with me is that hoodoo was one of the first magical practices to monetize, where people began to make money from working magically. And that created this incredible competitiveness and this absolute need to ostracize other workers. And so, yeah, it's not a happy place to be sometimes unless you're really confident in what you're doing and willing to just shut out the outside world as far as their impression of whether or not you have the right to be there. And so you've got a lot of people who are very frustrated that on the surface, just at first blush, we have people who appear to be, and they have their own ethnicity, appear to be Caucasian, who are making a lot of money off of an African American tradition. And so that's where it gets a little bit dicey sometimes. And then you've got people saying that this person isn't legit and that person isn't legit, and it just gets really angry. Many of these people that you see here have taught me a lot. Maya, as I said, is one of my own mentors. Talia Felix actually wrote the cookbook that I use more than any, which is the Conjure Cookbook. Orion Foxwood has my heart because this guy has beautifully blended the practice of root working with my own stomping grounds, Appalachian magic. Dorothy Morrison is an amazing witch who has written wonderful conjure books. And so you're going to see a lot of voices out here in the hoodoo community. Chief Amachi has wonderful videos that you will enjoy. Stephanie Rose Bird wrote a book called Six Stones, Roots and Bones that's wonderful. So explore, learn. If you are interested in this path, find out who resonates with you and what their truths are. But at the same time, do not superimpose their truths over your own and what you feel. Find your own truth as well, while giving respect to those who came before and have worked very hard to get to where they are. Now, we're going to talk about the developmental stages of hoodoo, and the first stage is the black belt tradition. It was adapted directly from the Western and Central African practices that came over when the slave traders brought over the indigenous Africans. And it's very important that we honor this phase as the beginning phase of hoodoo. And it was the time when hoodoo was the most pure and in its strongest form. We then move forward to the post-Reconstruction phase, which is the time after the Civil War through about the time of World War II. And this is when we had the African diaspora moving upwards into the North for various reasons, none of them enjoyable. And as they moved forward, we had a different type of hoodoo that developed from that movement. And part of that was the marketeered hoodoo, which is when people began to sell these displaced African Americans up in the North their products that they could no longer get from the South. And that changed hoodoo yet again. And the ultimate outcome was what we call prefab or urban hoodoo, which is pretty much what you see now. We're going to start in the black belt traditional hoodoo. And again, I want to say there was no, at that time, distinction between the sacred and the secular. We had the spiritual aspect all wrapped up with the magical aspect. And this time period more closely mirrored the traditional conjure experience that the displaced African Americans, now African Americans, had when they were in Africa. They worked with natural products to achieve supernatural results. And in the 200 something of note is in the 246 years between 1619 and 1865, when the Civil War ended, over 2 million Africans were enslaved and brought to America. And they were brought over in stages. So we had a constant blending. We had an acclimation of and a blending. So we had African slaves who were brought over who are integrating their practice into the life that they now have. Then we have new slaves coming over. So it's continually awakening and infusing the practice with practice from Africa. And at this time, Africa was also being forced into accepting Catholicism and the Christian religion. So that also influenced what happened over here. Now, the Native Americans were particularly influential because the Africans had specific roots, specific herbs, specific ways to heal that happened in Africa. And when they got to the American South, they no longer had those tools and they had to adapt into what was available there. And that's where the Native Americans came into play, because they were able to teach the Africans what types of herbs and roots and cures they used to do the same thing. So if they wanted something to take away fever in Africa, they had a particular herb or root that they would use. They needed to now know, okay, what grows in Alabama does the same thing. And the Native Americans were there to teach them. And also the Native Americans learned from the Africans different ways to use the herbs and roots that they had. So the practices blended to some degree. The Native Americans became influential. You would think that it was almost separate, but it wasn't, because the Native Americans were also slaves. The Native Americans also owned slaves, and the Native Americans married slaves. And this allowed for this integration of the two cultures. There was still an emphasis on healing protection, and part of that protection was involving retribution as well. Now, throughout the changes that happened in black belt traditional hoodoo, as we integrated new slaves into the existing slave culture, is we had 8 consistent components that tended to remain true. One is that they used a counterclockwise sacred circle motion in dancing and in sacred music. And that was actually called a ring shout. And I will post a link in the comments section or in the informational section of this video that allows you to hear what that sounded like. And you could hear the power in this process that builds energy as this singing and shouting occurred. They also worked with spiritual possession and the practice of sacrifice, ritual water immersions, divination. They believed in a spiritual cause of maladies and of injury, that if it happened, it was because God intended that, or because you did something wrong, or that it was sent to you by someone. They used herbal and nature based medicines, and ancestor worship and veneration was very strong within this community. There were some significant shifts that occurred during this stage, and a lot of this was adaptation to the new surroundings. Now, one huge cultural shift that happened is that when these people were captured and brought over, there were existing conjure doctors who had been almost like the medicine men of the tribes in Africa. And they were venerated. They were religious men who were highly respected in the community. They were captured and brought over and sent into the fields just like everybody else. So they no longer had the prestige that they had before. And so they had to move their distinction amongst untenable conditions to be able to still practice. The veneration of ancestors was almost completely destroyed as families were separated, and there was no longer a sense of ancestry, which really shifted and changed this wonderful and vibrant and historical uh, practice. The depths of practice that happened were purely based on what type of crops, believe it or not, were grown in an area, and you wouldn't think that would have a huge influence. However, for instance, if they were on a plantation that grew tobacco, it was usually a small scale operation with no more than 10 or sometimes even one or two or five slaves to work that crop. And so you had a limited number of people who are sharing and healing and carrying on those traditions. Whereas if they were working with rice, they would have 30. And so there's a bigger collection of people to remember what it was like in Africa, to remember the practices that took place. At the turn of the century, the 19th century, a significant thing happened, and we're skipping ahead a little bit, and we'll get back to a couple of other things. But what happened was that cotton became a huge force in commodities, and that was because the British textile trade really took off. The cotton gin was produced, which increased productivity by 50 times. And so, whereas in 1790 there were around 700,000 slaves in America, by 1860 it had grown to 4 million or more, because they wanted to work these huge cotton plantations. So it caused what's called the Second Middle Passage, which is where slavery went up on an increase due to the greed of collecting the money from these textile operations. So you can see how this would, in some ways, enliven hoodoo. Not that this was anything good to come out of this situation, but it did bring in a huge influx of people to be able to share practices and ideas and to work together to create and develop hoodoo in America. In the early 1800s was when they began to syncretize onto the Protestant Christianity, and in Louisiana onto Catholicism. In 1748, we're working backwards here, there was a huge aggressive restriction against the medical practices. Until this time, until 1748, often the white slave owners would go to the African American conjure doctors to be healed, because they knew that they had experience and talent to do this. If your child is sick, you're going to get that child healed, even if that means going to your slave and saying, "Can you help me?" And so there was a respect for the slave tradition. And what happened around 1748 is there was a series of poisonings where slaves were poisoning the slave owners, and it happened not in this giant wave, but here and there, enough that they began to say, well, we can't have these people practicing medicine anymore because they are having knowledge of herbs that can kill. And so there were these huge restrictions in place against the medical practice amongst the slaves, and they had to kind of do it on the sly when that happened. And so that also shifted the practice. Now, as we move forward, we're going to talk about three different types of workers during this time, and we've mentioned some of them already. One is the conjure doctor, who does divinations, religious ceremonies, primarily working with uncrossings and getting rid of hexes and your basic conjure work. The root doctor, on the other hand, worked the root and did the healing and made medicine and took care of the medical aspects of healing, as opposed to the conjure or the magical aspects of healing. The two-headed doctor actually did both, and he was said to have his or her head in both the spirit and the physical world. Then we reach the constructionist stage. A lot of people, a lot of privileged white people actually, believe that when 1865 hit and suddenly slavery was illegal, that everything was just great for the African Americans, and it was in some ways worse than it was before. They're living amongst these previous slave owners who are pissed off that they can no longer own slaves. And so a lot of them moved north in order to escape this oppression. The black codes that were generated by some of the southern states were made life just untenable. And things like they couldn't vote, they couldn't own firearms, they couldn't gather together for religious observations or any reason. Didn't want a whole bunch of those African Americans together, because God knows what they'll do. They couldn't learn to read or write, which greatly restricted their advancement. But here's the real trick: they had to have a job. If they didn't have a job, they were loitering. So unless you were a sharecropper, you didn't really have a place in the South if you were a displaced African American slave. So they found that these Southern hostilities were not bearable and began to migrate north. Some of them went into Appalachia. That was a little bit friendlier toward freed slaves, and some of them went up north where they knew that there was work. What happened when they moved north is that migration cut them off from their supplies. They were no longer around the swampers, as they were called, who went out and dug the roots from the swamp and got the roots and the herbs organically or grew their own herbs. And that was when hoodoo began to be a separate and secular practice from the veneration and sacred side of the practice. There was an attack on midwifery nationwide that changed hoodoo. During this time, actually, it was his own Queen Victoria's fault, because Queen Victoria was the first woman documented, and it could have happened otherwise, to give birth under sedation. And that became all the rage, was to have your baby and be completely knocked out during this time. And when that occurred, there was a huge need for medical intervention from the non-slavery world. And that's when birth began to move into hospitals. And so there was this denigration of home birth and this denigration of people, lay midwives. You had to have a doctor deliver your baby because women were not capable of delivering babies on their own. And that attack on midwifery also changed hoodoo, not just because we were limited the access of the midwives and the ability of the midwives to work their practice and to work their craft, but also because the midwives were where we got things like CAUL, the CAUL, the amniotic membrane that covers the baby's face as they're being born, if the water didn't break. Things like umbilical cords, which were integral. Ground umbilical cord was a strong hoodoo tool. Placentas you also couldn't get anymore. So these were an important part of the practice that were no longer accessible because the doctors at the hospitals are not just going to hand those things out. As this began to break apart, hoodoo began to emerge into church practices. And this was a big deal because as we went into churches, the ring shout became almost impossible because of the linear pews that are in churches. So this translated out into the Pentecostal shouting. If you've ever been to a Pentecostal church or just a General Baptist church, you'll hear shouting and amen and praise God and a lot of, I guess you would say, audience interaction rather than just sitting back and listening to somebody preach. It is a group effort in the raising of the energy in the Christian church. Now, some are kind of laid back in terms of just listening and more formal. But sometimes you get some very happening church activity that goes on, and I've been involved in quite a bit of it. Snake handling, for instance, I'm from Kentucky, and we have churches that handle snakes there, and they use it as a form of uh, uh, expressing their faith, that they have faith that God will not allow the snake to bite them, and if the snake bites them and they become ill or they die, it's because they have offended God in some way, or they didn't have enough faith to handle the snake. And that actually comes from the Louisiana voodoo queens who handled snakes as part of their voodoo practice. But it was from a perspective of they are female and they are holding the snake, which represents the male. Another thing that came from the hoodoo influence was the idea of chanted, I guess you would say chanted preaching by the ministers. And so when you think about Joel Osteen, for instance, who is very conversational and speaks in the King's English and has a very perfect dialect, that's not what we're talking about. When you think about a Southern evangelist, you hear them talking like this. They're saying, God bless you, God bring you to us and keep you within his heart. And that is a form of the chanting that emerged from the ring shout that took place. And that still happens in Southern churches now. That way of speaking, that dialect, is from the chanting that happened. So a lot of our hoodoo practices are merging over into our church practices. And I remember when I was growing up, we had the Bethlehem Baptist Church, and that was the quote unquote black church. And we went to Red Hill Baptist Church, which was right down the road, which was the white church. And they were separated by maybe a mile. But oh my gosh, the Bethlehem Baptist Church seemed like so much more fun because they always came out of there full of the Spirit of God. And you could hear them singing and you could hear them shouting and you could hear them expressing just absolute religious ecstasy. And that didn't happen so much in the church that I went to. So it's just a whole different take on religion that was born out of those hoodoo practices. Some of the churches did continue the hoodoo practices, others did not. This particular stage was called the Golden Age of Hoodoo, primarily because of the Louisiana influence, where we had the voodoo celebrities like Dr. John and Dr. Buzzard and Marie Laveau really developing New Orleans hoodoo. Now, we're going to talk more in depth about New Orleans hoodoo in a little bit, so we don't want to jump the gun into that. So this is a huge, huge shift in hoodoo practice that occurred during this Reconstructionist stage and took us to the next stage, which is marketeered hoodoo in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Marketeered hoodoo was when we got all of these African American people who worked hoodoo up in the northern United States without the ability to get the things they needed to practice their craft. So we actually had, most commonly, Jewish business owners who stepped in to fill this gap. And they created marketeered hoodoo, which is where they created the items that the person would have gone to the Conjure doctor to get and the root working doctor, and they put them into mail order catalogs, and even drugstores begin to carry them. And they would have their little curio section that had hot foot powder in it, that had different hoodoo products for high john oil, this sort of thing, for the displaced root workers to purchase. The thing was, it was kind of twofold as to why this was screwed up. One is that it was obvious opportunism. These people, you could look at it from a business perspective and say they saw a niche and they went into it and they made money doing it. You can also look at it from, these are little white Jewish people who are selling these people's religion back to them, or these people's magical practice back to them. And they were doing so with less than optimum products. The African Americans were not above making money off of selling this information to these business owners, but sometimes they would give them incomplete recipes or misleading recipes that were not the actual recipe. Just like when your aunt gives you her recipe for biscuits, but she leaves out that one little special ingredient. Also, there was a hive mind that worked during in the South. When you've got a lot of people who believe in this and a lot of people who are practicing this, all of that belief comes together to fuel the practice. And when you've got these people who are doing it for the money, it's not coming through with the same strength of belief and the same power into the products. They're also not getting the products from the swamps. They're not getting the products from the fields. They are taking shortcuts and making them as inexpensively as they can and then selling them to the African Americans. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to work. It just means it's not going to work as well with the strength or purity that it would have. Um, 50 years earlier, 100 years earlier in the South. The roots were no longer freshly harvested. They're no longer dug up from the swamp. They're not infused by the prayer and incantations. When you're in a factory making hot foot powder, you're not sitting there focusing and praying on what's happening with that hot foot powder. The drugstores were usually more reliable than the mail order. And along about the end of World War II, we began to have candle shops emerge. Now, you'll notice that we're talking about roots and we're talking about herbs. We didn't talk about candles because, and that's really big in hoodoo work right now, is the prepping of a candle or the fixing of a candle. And it works great. It's fabulous. But they didn't have it in the original black belt hoodoo because candles were crazy expensive. They're only going to be up in the big house. And so candles were not much used during that time. But as we moved forward out of World War II, we began to see candle shops emerging. And it was as the candle shops came about that we began to have the fixed candles that worked the magic as well. And that was great for these displaced African American hoodoo workers because they could get it all in one. They could have the candle plus have the herbs and the roots on top of it when it was appropriately dressed and oiled and worked for them. Those usually closed around the 60s and 70s as the psychedelic shops came into vogue. Now, all of this being said, there were still some families that were able to pass on those authentic ATR practices and move them generationally through the family. So I'm not saying that authentic black belt hoodoo does not still exist. There are some places where it does, but most of the time when you're reading a book on Amazon about hoodoo or you're talking to a root worker about hoodoo, you're talking about a strongly amalgamated practice that has been affected by all these changes that we've talked about. This was some of the typical mail order ads that took place between World War I and World War II. They would use a lot of buzzwords that would let the hoodoo worker know that this is for them. And they would use fictive kin titles like, oh, Mama Davis's Van Van oil, or Brother David's High John powder, to make it seem like they were close with you, to create a sense of family there that these people are missing because they're not usually with their families. And it made good marketing, actually, is what it made. A lot of these, as you can see here, what they were selling is from that Louisiana-based voodoo as opposed to the black belt hoodoo. Some of the most common companies were LaClyde, the King Novelty Company, Famous Products, Valmore Beauty Products, Lucky Hearts Cosmetics Company, and Cloverhorn Company that ran these ads in the backs of magazines. And this was called homogenized hoodoo or prefab hoodoo because it didn't have the spirit in it that was prevalent before. This is some of the magazines that were very common to have those ads in the back. And you can see that these are marketed mostly to African American people in the hopes that they're going to order from these companies to get their items. So that was the progression forward. And now we're going to back up a little bit and go into the Louisiana, New Orleans voodoo, which is a little bit different. It had a very strong Haitian influence, very strong Cuban influence, uh, layered onto the base of ATR practice that came over from Africa. It did syncretize with the French Catholic rather than with the Christian Protestant, which the African hoodoo layered onto. The Louisiana New Orleans voodoo introduced the voodoo doll in the classic sense that you think of when you think of a voodoo doll. And we're going to look at some pictures of that to show you the difference. They also introduced the idea of the gris-gris or the hoodoo uh, bag. Before this, they would use a trick, as it was called, which was just a little collection of items in a bag. But a lot of the practices for the gris-gris came from the French. And of course, they were colognists, perfumists. And so they developed a lot of the colognes, a lot of the oils, and they were the ones who had the image of the voodoo queen and the voodoo kings. This was not something that happened in black belt hoodoo. They had their root workers, they had their conjure doctors, but they did not have the attitude of kings and queens. And in New Orleans hoodoo, they had these huge gatherings in the 1800s, and Marie Laveau was one of the ones instrumental in this. And there would be thousands of people that would come to these gatherings to see these voodoo queens perform and to see them raise the energy and create the magic. And that was all a New Orleans thing there. New Orleans voodoo really kind of combined with the hoodoo so that it did become one practice. And so a lot of times when you're talking to somebody who works New Orleans hoodoo, they are also working with the Loa and with the saints and integrating that strongly into their practice. And again, the amalgamation and the blending melting pot of what happened specifically in New Orleans and Louisiana was so strong that it was just a huge conglomerative effort, as opposed to what happened with African American hoodoo outside of the bayou areas, where it tended to stay more the same and less influenced by all of these other aspects. Now, the hoodoo doll babies, when you think about them, that's what you usually see when you think about the voodoo dolls of Hollywood. And usually somebody's jabbing them with pins to hurt somebody. In actuality, the hoodoo doll babies or voodoo dolls are rarely used to harm someone. Now, they can harm them just fine. They do just a beautiful job of harming people, but that's very rarely the intention. Usually what happens is they're used to heal, or they're used to bind somebody away from you to get them out of your influence, or they're used to bring two people together as lovers or as partners. Now, up here you see, and down below, what the traditional African fetches look like, or what the doll babies look like. And they were usually wood, usually sticks. They might have Spanish moss with them, or they might have strings wrapped all around them. And they were pushed with narrow sticks, and that evolved into pins. And they would use them to inflict energy into it. It wasn't to harm or to hurt that part of the body, but to centralize your energy into the doll baby. What we had with New Orleans voodoo were these doll babies, which were made of linen or burlap, and they're poofy. They're like a plushie almost. And that wasn't the case with these other ones. And they would do the same thing with the pins to get energy into a certain part of the body, to push intention into it. In either case, the dolls were imbued with their own spirit, and the purpose of the spirit was to do what you told it to do, to take care of you, or to bring someone to you, or whatever it might be that you wanted to have happen. As I mentioned, the New Orleans influence also accounted for a lot of the makeup and the oils and the colognes that came out, like Hoyt's cologne, like Van oil, like Florida water. A lot of the floor washes came from the New Orleans voodoo influence. Florida water itself is one of my favorite products. Four Thieves vinegar, Chinese wash. These were all used within New Orleans hoodoo, and they are prominent in today's society of hoodoo. Here you can even see Lucky Face Powder that is infused with herbs, that when you use it on your face, it brings love to you. This took us to a point of urban hoodoo. And again, it often doesn't have that hive mind effect or the mindful spirituality that we got in black belt hoodoo. A lot of it is super commercialized, super marketeered. And it does represent the majority, not all, but the majority of what we see in hoodoo today in the United States. Urban hoodoo right now is an amalgam practice of authentic hoodoo, of Cajun, New Orleans hoodoo, of French and Creole influence, with some of Appalachian and Native American components to it. And it is now considered a secular magical practice. If you ask any root worker the difference in hoodoo and voodoo, most of them are going to say hoodoo is a magical practice that does not have a religious influence, and voodoo is an actual religion. It is highly competitive, as we pointed out, and it's very externally focused. It's usually about others rather than working on yourself. Now, where might you have seen hoodoo in today's culture? One of the strongest expressions of hoodoo or voodoo is in the movie The Skeleton Key from 2005. And oh my gosh, did that girl have a buttload of brick dust. This is Kate Hudson. who plays the central figure in this movie. And if you ever have a chance to watch it, it does accurately reflect voodoo and hoodoo to some degree. However, she's got this huge trough of brick dust, which is crazy expensive. I have people come into my shop and say, "Why is your brick dust so expensive?" And I just tilt down my glasses and look at them and say, "Have you ever made brick dust? This stuff is a mother to make." And our bricks that we use, in fact, come from a barn up in Grizzly Flats where we live, and they're over 100 years old. And even red brick that is clay brick that's over 100 years old, when you attempt to break that down, you are going to be working and building muscles and be sore for about a week. And it takes days to get this stuff fine enough to be used. But I have extremely good luck with brick dust as a barrier. I use it a lot at my shop because we get a lot of different kinds of people walking past our door, and I only want the people who are supposed to be in there to be in my shop. So that's a big component of the skeleton key, is the use of the brick dust and the use of salts as barriers. So this is one place that you would have seen hoodoo practiced in day-to-day life. So feel free to contact me if you have questions about hoodoo or voodoo. That is my understanding of the development of it. And I understand, again, as I said at the beginning, that might not be your truth, but it is what I've been able to suss out. In fact, my truth is different from that of my mentors. I was taught something very different, and went deeper and around and came up with a different truth of my own, still honoring what I was taught from the truth of my advisors. And everybody has to do that. You know, you've got to take what you're taught and you've got to move forward with it and see what your truth is. So I strongly advise people who are interested in the study of hoodoo to look into it, see what all involves. It's very hands-on, it's very applicable, it's very effective, and very right now. It's what I had a friend in Texas who, when I was talking to her, said that she was teaching her class right now magic. And I looked at her and I said, "Well, what's right now magic?" She says, "You know, when you need something right now." And boy, that's hoodoo. Um, when I said at the beginning what Victor Anderson said about white magic is poetry, black magic is what works, this is the part that works. White magic can work too, if you want to call it that, but this is a very direct and strong uh, energy application and working in conjunction with natural elements that works very, very well. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.